Hey, thank you for a great question. I would argue that the vilification of Asherah arose within the context of Josiah's campaign of cult centralization, which took place in the 7th century BCE. But we need to know a little bit of historical background in order to understand what Josiah was getting at. Prior to the reign of Hezekiah, around a century before Josiah, the archaeological data indicate that there were cult sites and private shrines and temples all over the lands of Israel and Judah, and there's no indication that anybody had a problem with it. Adonai would be worshipped alongside Asherah and other deities. Under the reign of Hezekiah, there seems to be an initial shift. And we have the invasion of the Assyrian king Sennacherib likely to blame for this. Because Sennacherib comes in to try to restore Judah to vassalage and devastates the landscape, destroys cities, destroys cult sites and temples all over the place. And we also have some indication that Hezekiah may have hidden some temples in order to protect them from this coming invasion. The temple at Arad, for instance, when it was uncovered in the 60s, initially scholars said, oh, this is one of the high places that Hezekiah destroyed. But the cult site wasn't really destroyed. The divine images, the incense altars were just kind of laid on their side, and then the whole thing was buried in about 6 feet of earth, which many scholars now argue would better fit an intentional decommissioning and hiding of the temple to protect it from this coming invasion, with the goal of later uncovering it and recommissioning it, which unfortunately for them never happened, but fortunately for us helped to preserve a lot of the site, which includes indications of the worship of other entities, not just Adonai. And so the combination of hiding some cult sites and of the destruction of most of the rest of the cult sites creates what scholars refer to as a de facto cult centralization. In other words, there's only one main functioning cult site now, and that's the temple in Jerusalem, the city that didn't get destroyed. And so the kings between Hezekiah and Josiah likely tried to restore a lot of the worship that was going on before, which was not seen as problematic. And this probably was just barely getting off the ground. And then we have Josiah, who probably saw all of these resources, all of this attention, all this power, all this wealth being funneled into the temple in Jerusalem and decided, hey, kind of like it this way. Let's keep it this way. But to keep it that way, you can't just say, I decree that this is how it's going to be. And so we have the production of the Deuteronomistic literature, which most scholars believe began, the earliest layers of it, began under the reign of Josiah. And this is an attempt to create divine commands that limit worship to only the temple in Jerusalem, that limit worship only to Adonai, that limit worship only to the priesthood of Adonai that is in Jerusalem. And so Josiah institutes this program of cult centralization, and part of it is reframing the history of previous periods as apostasy, as people knowingly going against the commands of God, even though they're creating the commands as they go and then retrojecting them into the past. So the history of Israel that sees the kings prior to Josiah as wicked, corrupt kings who threw off the worship of Adonai to go chasing after other deities is likely an historical fiction, an attempt to create a mythical past that we are now trying to correct with the Deuteronomistic literature, with the revision, the editing of other Hebrew Bible legislation that takes place in the exilic period and after. And so as a part of this campaign of cult centralization, you've got to vilify Asherah. You've got to vilify the priesthood of Asherah. You've got to vilify all of the other deities and all of the other means of worship that were perfectly normative and perfectly acceptable in prior periods. And that, unfortunately, is the revised history that gets preserved within the Hebrew Bible and becomes the authoritative history for the generations that came after. And I talk a little bit about this in my book, Adonai's Divine Images, which is open access, freely available on my link tree. And I talk about it primarily in relation to the idea of divine images and how the conceptualization of divine images shifted through this cult centralization, through the periods of the exile, through the post-exilic period.